Have you ever heard of the V trick? The Princeton V? The Turtleback? No? Then you probably heard of the flying wedge. The names I've just mentioned were amongst the earliest plays in football. They came about in the years 1884 to 1894, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. The earliest formation football plays, mass momentum plays, and the rule changes and the concerns they had all brought about. First, let's talk about the state of American football in 1890. Rules changes have come about to make sure that the American game is different than rugby. Specifically, I'm talking about the establishment of possession, or the concept of possession in the American game, where there is none in rugby, and the system of downs, the idea that we have 4 downs at that time to gain 5 yards. Both of these made the games distinct from rugby and made it a truly American game. By 1890, 2 more rules were established to make the game even more American. Tackling below the waist was allowed, which is not allowed in rugby, and blocking in front of a ball carrier was allowed. Blocking was originally called interference, and it has kind of an odd history. There was never a formal rule that stated a blocker could be in front of the ball carrier, but there were rules against offsides. And when I say offsides, you're probably thinking of American football, where a defensive player comes across the line of scrimmage, and therefore they're offsides. When they're talking about early American football and they mention offsides, that's not what they mean. What they mean is the offsides in like the concept of soccer or in rugby, where an offensive player cannot be in front of the player with the ball. In other words, the ball has to precede everybody else down the field. Obviously, that's not how it works with blocking. So what happened was for a while, they called it in some games illegal, being offsides illegal, in some games they didn't. It was up to whatever the official or the teams at the time the games decided, or perhaps where they were playing. Like, for example, if they were playing at Cornell and Cornell didn't like offsides, then they didn't call it. And then when they finally passed the rule that said, yes, we can have blocking or interference in front of a ball carrier, it changed the entire offensive system for football. So in 1884, a play called the V trick was introduced. The V trick was the original wedge play, and it was the forerunner of all the mass plays to come. It's a play that was made up on the fly by Princeton quarterback Richard Hodge. His team wasn't making any headway or gaining any yardage against Pennsylvania, Penn, which is one of the big teams at the time, with 7 men running abreast, in other words, all in a line. So he decides to put them in a V, in the form of a V, with the ball carrier inside the V and the apex forward. And it has amazing success gaining yardage from midfield to the 5-yard line. And since it was made up on the fly, they just kind of forgot about it, and it's abandoned for a year or so. And then in 1886, it's used again by Princeton after they practiced it. And by 1888, it is so well known that it's used by every football team in the country. It was the standard opening play for everyone. Much like we start a game with a kickoff, they would start a game with the V trick. Now keep in mind there were no rules at that time that required you to kick the ball on a kickoff 10 years. So teams typically just kick the ball to themselves or put it in play to themselves, much like putting a ball in play in soccer. You kick the ball to yourself and your own teammate gets it, and then you start playing. By the time everyone is using it, it's become perfect in form. Park Davis, a historian, describes it like this. The V, as finally perfected, was formed by the 11 players taking positions in a solid V-shaped mass, apex forward, the arms of the players encircling the bodies of one another. The play formed 10 yards back from the opponent's rush line, in other words, the line of scrimmage. The player with the ball stood at the apex of the V. When all were ready, the ball was technically kicked off by being touched to the toe and ground simultaneously but without being released. The mass then started heavily forward. The player with the ball disappeared within it, and the opponents charged. Breaking one of these ponderous machines was not gentle play, since this could only be accomplished by throwing oneself directly in front of the mass and upsetting its apex while the other players crushed in its flanks. This sounds insane. Allison Danzig in the History of American Football describes how teams would take on the V trick, the play. Walter Heffelfinger was a really known large guy that played for Yale, and Danzig describes his play against the V like this. Heffelfinger rushed at the mighty human engine, leapt high in the air, completely clearing its forward ramparts, and came down on top of the men inside the wedge, whom he flattened to the ground, among them the ball carrier. That gives you an idea what football was like at that time, which is, well, it's kind of insane compared to the football we watch. And you can go through newspaper accounts and find references to the V trick on both kickoffs and from normal scrimmage plays. And it was used quite a bit, and it was obviously a recognized formation by everybody because there are so many references to it in the newspaper accounts. And like I said earlier, it was the forerunner of all the mass play that would come play later. And it's because of the V trick that everybody starts slowly kind of disregarding offsides play as it pertains to rugby. And since everybody is using it, then they come up with the blocking rule. They pass the rule that formally allows blocking. So on to the flying wedge. 1892 brings about the introduction of the most spectacular play in the history of football. That's not an exaggeration. Park Davis, who wrote the book Football, the American Collegiate Game, talks about how the play was introduced by Harvard against Yale, keep in mind, 1892. To the surprise of players and spectators, the Crimson, Harvard, did not form a V, which again was the standard kickoff play. Instead, B.W. Trafford, holding the ball, took a position at the center of Harvard's 45-yard line. The remaining 10 men divided into two sections and fell back to the 25-yard line, each section grouping near the sideline, but at opposite sides of the field. Without putting the ball in play, Trafford waved his hand, and the two sections came swiftly forward in lockstep, converging towards Trafford and gathering tremendous momentum as they ran. Just as they reached Trafford, the latter put the ball in play and disappeared within the mass of men, then thus launching against the Yale men standing in their tracks, the famous flying wedge. So when you go out on the internet and you look up flying wedge, you're likely going to run into this photo. And when you look at it, it doesn't really look that imposing. I mean, it honestly looks goofy. It just looks like a bunch of guys kind of stuck together in a football formation, a really illegal and weird football formation. But this is a still photo, and that's not what the flying wedge was. The flying wedge was men moving in motion toward a point of attack on the defense. And those men are moving before the ball is put in play or snapped, because there are no rules that state you have to be set on the line before the ball is snapped. There are no rules that state how many men can be in the backfield. And there are no rules that say how many men can be in motion at any one time before the ball is put in play. So those rules would all come much, much later after mass momentum plays proved to be incredibly dangerous. And, you know, you look at the flying wedge and think about it in motion. And I wish I could animate this so that it would actually show what it would have been like. But I don't know how to do that. So if anybody watches this and says, hey, I could animate a flying wedge play for you, please leave me a comment or a way to contact you. And we'll see what it did, because I think this play would be awesome for people to understand what momentum plays were really about. So keep in mind what we're talking about here. We're talking about two groups. This is on a kickoff. Two groups of men back away from the ball, And then they start running and they converge basically on the ball carrier where he's going to pick the ball up. And by the time they hit the defense, they are running at full speed into a defense that's standing there. And they didn't just run these plays at kickoff. They ran these plays during scrimmage plays where basically the offense would be in motion and the defense would have to stand. So if you're a guy that's like a defensive tackle, or basically what we would consider a defensive tackle, you're standing there and a whole mass of guys are running right at you, and the only thing you can do is throw yourself at their feet and hope to knock the first of them down. That's pretty much how it worked. The flying wedge becomes not just a play in the Harvard-Yale game in 1992, but it consumes public interest, at least the people that were interested in football, and it remains the subject of football for a few years. And it introduces the term flying wedge, which I'm sure had never been used before that, except maybe in warfare with the concept of a phalanx formation. But sooner or later, everybody is using the flying wedge, much like they're using the V-trick. So the flying wedge was invented by a guy named Loren F. Deland. And he never played football himself. He was known for being a good chess player. But here's an article about Deland from the Kansas City Star on November 30th, 1892 that I thought you would find interesting. I certainly did. Mr. Deland's entrance into the football world is going to throw the old heroes, Camp, Stagg, Heffelfinger, and the other famous coaches into the shade. It marks an era in the evolution of the game, a step forward in strategic progress. Mr. Deland's principle is the application of the art of war to football. For years, it had been his hobby to study the art and strategy of war. He made himself thoroughly familiar with all the details of the great battles recorded in history and had worked out on maps and drawings the decisive battles of the world. Then one day, a friend took him to a football game. He was immediately interested. It was war. Two armies in miniature were being hurled at each other, and he saw the ideal scientific combats of his imagination wage in reality. Struck by the similarities between a scientifically played game of football and the art of war, he began a long study of strategy as seen in war and applied to the game of football. He constructed a miniature football field 5 feet long and drawn to a scale with mathematical nicety. On this, he studied out his momentum play, as he calls the flying wedge, and several other moves which had yet to be tried. According to him, it is nothing more or less than the application of football of one of Napoleon's favorite methods for turning the enemy's flank. The two advantageous points in the play are the tremendous momentum gained by the 11 starting away back of the line and being on a dead run when the ball is put into play, and secondly, the confusion it creates in the minds of the players on the other side. What an article. It's wonderful. If you go back and look through history, you realize that you need articles written like this written about yourselves to become legend or myth. They have to have a certain level of embellishment. And was Billy Kidd really the fastest gun in the West? Well, it sold a lot of dime store novels, so yes, he was. But what you find is a lot of bovine scatology being used in these articles. And it's fun to read some of them. Deland's invention goes on to create all sorts of new offensive schemes and plays. So let's look at some of the other plays that came out of the flying wedge and the concept of momentum plays, which is when you're running when you hit the line. Historian Park Davis describes for us a play called the Turtleback. And it was a play executed by forming 11 men in the shape of a solid oval against a selected point in the rush line, in other words, the line of scrimmage, usually the tackle, and at the snap of the ball into the interior of the oval, rolling the mass around the end, thus unwinding the runner into a clear field. And he also described for us another play that was called the push play, which basically a formation similar to the turtleback, but the runner was lifted on top of the mast and pushed over the opposing rush line. In other words, they all got back and they basically lifted this guy up, I don't know, like a dancer, and just pushed him over the top of everybody. These people are insane. They really are. This is nuts, looking at some of these plays. But the turtleback sounds like a play diagrammed in a book by Amos Alonzo Stagg called A Scientific and Practical Treatise on American Football for Schools and Colleges, published in 1894. The play is number 40. Stagg calls it Revolving Wedge from a Down, and he describes it. Here's the key to the description. The ball is put in play immediately and the entire wedge plunges straight forward into a closely compacted body. After a few seconds, when the opposing sides have massed themselves in front of the wedge so that its forward progress is nearly blocked, the entire formation throws its weight to one side, each man turning slightly in order to face the direction in which he is to proceed, and attempts to revolve around the opposing team, turning upon the center as a pivot. The very fact that the opponents are pushing with the utmost force any direction exactly contrary to the original line of advancing the wedge is a great assistance in performing the evolution, in other words, turning. When this wedge has swung sufficiently around, the rear men may break away and dash down the field with the ball. This is actual football people watched. Play 47 from Stagg's book is called Running Mass Wedge Through the Center. The play description includes, the vital point in the play is that all strike the line as nearly as possible at the same instant and form a tightly massed wedge which is driven directly through the line. It's pretty clear from reading old newspaper accounts that people are not really thrilled with the momentum plays. They're thrilled if their team wins, but the violence and the viciousness of the games are taking their toll on people. Previously to these rule changes, you had a wide open game where people were completely across the field, like in rugby, where they were spread out. And these plays are just, they're condensed, and they're just basically bodies smashing into each other, and the crowds don't like them. The one comparison I thought about this was, think about the Big Ten's old motto, or what they used to say about the Big Ten, 3 yards and a cloud of dust. Another comparison would be the NFL, what we're seeing right now compared to like the NFL of probably 10 to 15 years ago. And I'm using the NFL as a comparison because the NFL is uniform across. Everybody has the same rules. Everybody plays with the same amount of money. They get a draft. Everything's consistent across the board. College, you have some schools that have massive amounts of money. You have small schools. You have 4 divisions really. And you have, I don't know how many hundreds of schools there are across those 4 divisions. You have every offense imaginable. But if you look at the NFL like 10 to 15 years ago, everybody ran the same offense. It was the same statuesque quarterback standing in a pocket. Everybody ran the same formations. I want to say everything was like a variety of the West Coast offense. That's probably not really true, but it was boring. It was really boring compared to now. You look at the NFL now, and you have quarterbacks like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, and they can do so many different things. They're mobile, and they're part of the offense. They don't just stand in the pocket and throw the ball to somebody or hand it off. They're actually an active participant in the offense. And that is so much more fun to watch than the NFL was 10 to 15 years ago. And I'd like to think that that's kind of the comparison of what the crowds were used to seeing, what the rugby style play, where the teams were stretched across the field, and now they're just mass momentum. They're just masses packing, smashing into each other. And I think the other thing they get frustrated with is, like I said earlier, you have these mass plays. They start forward. The only way for the defense to stop them is to throw themselves at them. And it becomes boring. Another problem at the time is the rules bodies. The Intercollegiate Football Association is breaking up because of disagreements between the schools on how the game should be played. So the University Athletic Club of New York decided they'd do something about it. And they invite Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Penn, which were the big four at the time, they also invited the leading official of football from the U.S. Navy to join them, as the Army-Navy game was not played in 1894 because of the level of violence in the sport. Now, you can go out on the internet and find articles that state it was because of a feud between officers. I didn't really find that when I looked through the history of it. What I found was that the service academies basically said, we're not going to allow this kind of football, and therefore they didn't abolish the game, but they stated that the teams would only play home games, which meant Army and Navy couldn't play each other. So the Intercollegiate Football Association is replaced by the Intercollegiate Rules Committee, and note that the whole idea of an NCAA is still like a decade away. So it's way out there. So at the end of the 1893 seasons, there's major changes to the rules. First of all, they outlawed the momentum mass play. Momentum mass play is one where more than 3 men start before the ball is put in play. And the rule states, nor shall more than 3 men group for that purpose more than 5 yards back of the point where the ball is put in play. In other words, they get rid of the momentum part of the plays, but they don't get rid of the mass part of the plays. Another rule change, they reduced the length of the game from 90 to 70 minutes, divided into 2 halves of 35 minutes each. So if you can imagine being run over for 90 minutes by mass plays and momentum plays, the reduction of the game to 70 minutes has to at least mean something. And number 3, they prohibited their players from laying their hands on an opponent unless the opponent had the ball. Players of the side in possession with the ball may be obstructed with the body only. So basically what this did was stop blocking by grabbing somebody with their hands. The other way this can be translated is as the no slugging rule, and we'll get to that in a minute. And here's a big one, number 4, specifying that the ball must travel 10 yards on a kickoff to be put in play unless touched by an opponent. So it brings into existence our modern kickoff rules. Basically, can't just kick the ball to yourself or touch it and keep it. You have to actually kick it to the other opponent. And then number 5, adding a linesman to the referee and umpire as a third official. There's 3 officials now. And then number 6, there shall be no piling up upon the runner after he has cried down, and keep that in mind, cried down. In other words, he's yelled down, called himself down, or the referee has blown his whistle. Infraction of this rule shall be penalized by advancing the ball 10 yards for the offended side. So rule number 1, like I said, it outlaws the momentum plays, but not the mass plays. You bring into existence the modern kickoff, and then there's this idea of adding another official. Well, why do we need another official? And the idea is that it's going to cut down on the amount of slugging, quote, slugging on the field. Players would regularly slug each other, and then the officials would not do anything about it. And they're reluctant. According to one newspaper account I read, they're reluctant to take action because if they do, the team they took action against, for example, kicking a player out of the game, will be angry with them and then won't let them be an official anymore. So there is tons of looking the other way by the umpires and the referees. And mostly they're like, oh, I didn't see it, that kind of stuff. You have a lot of stuff going on with football. And around the same time that the rules changes come out, the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, releases a scathing report about football. And all of this comes to a head in 1894 game between Yale and Harvard, in which 8 players are injured, 4 for each side out of the 22 on the field. It's so bad that it becomes known as the Hampden Park bloodbath, because of the level of viciousness and injuries that occur on the field. And I looked around for some description of the injuries, and what I found was a post from the Yale News on November 18th, 2011, which detailed the injuries. Yale tackle Fred Murphy hit Harvard tackle Bob Hallowell during an officials conference and broke the Crimson player's nose. Murphy would later take a hard hit to the head, which left him unconscious for 5 hours in a Springfield hospital as rumors of his death circulated, but he recovered from the concussion. Al Jerams and Frank Butterworth also received head injuries. Yale captain and four-time All-American Frank Hinkey broke Harvard's Edgar Wrightington's collarbone following a fair catch, and Charles Brewer's broken leg only added to the list of Harvard casualties. Harvard's Johnny Hayes and Yale's Richard Armstrong were ejected from the competition for excessive violence. Following Yale's 12-4 victory, rivaling fans took the pattern of violence into the street. The biggest thing about this is there's a huge uproar about Wrightington's broken collarbone. The idea is that he's down on the field and Hinkey comes across the field and hits and basically jumps on him with his knees when he's down. There's a big dispute about that. There's an investigation in the newspaper accounts and testimonies from officials and players that say this never happened the way people think it did. And one player says, I was on the field and Hinkey was afar, like 10 yards away from the play when this supposedly happened. Hinkey gets attacked in the papers and he's subsequently defended. And all of this, what the result is that all of this brings more attention to the brutality of the sport of football. And it presents football as a vicious, brutal sport, which is exactly what many of its critics are saying, like Charles Elliott. The result of the 1894 game is that Yale and Harvard don't play each other for another 3 years. And this would be like the equivalent of Ohio State and Michigan not playing, because that's the level of rivalry this is, not just for Yale-Harvard, but for college football fans across the nation. Football is clearly under attack, and it's in danger of being abolished completely. So what happens is Walter Camp, the father of American football, issues a book called Football Fact and Figures, in which he surveys like 1,200 football players from across the nation about what they think about the game of football, about the game, if it's too vicious, is it too brutal? And it's like asking people who like M&Ms if they like M&Ms. The book is clearly a propaganda piece for the sport of football. Heading into 1895, college football is under heavy attack. You've got Charles Elliott, the biggest critic in football, and his influence amongst all the people that agree with him. And then you've got Walter Camp at the other side, who's doing the propaganda pieces for football, and people that are on his side. And the public is outraged at all the violence, and they don't care for the mass plays. They got rid of the momentum plays, but they still don't care for the mass plays. And Walter Camp is doing his best to save football. There is no central rules authority because the University Athletic Club became the Intercollegiate Rules Committee, and they've kind of fallen apart. So at the end of the year, going into 1895, it's complete chaos for football. And there's doubts that the game is going to persist. I mean, obviously we know that the game persists because it's the game that we all love today. But what happens next? Maybe I should title this, You Won't Believe What Happens Next. It'd be a nice clickbait title. But that's where I'm going to stop for this video, because there's just so much that went on. Honestly, I had a hard time keeping track of all of it. There's actually issues in here that I didn't touch in this segment, such as the use of tramp players, which are players that are not students, or the idea that football teams, college football teams, are playing like town football teams that are full of fully grown, mature men who then beat the holy hell out of them. There's a lot going on in the early days of football that really I don't see reported on in a lot of places unless you go out and dig through history books. This is John Johnston, founder of Corn Nation. I hope you enjoyed this. I plan on doing more. We've got the next controversies coming up, and it's going to get much worse before it gets better. So please let me know what you think of this video. Please give me some feedback. If you like this format, if you don't, thank you for listening.